My name is Clara Hensley, 32 years old, and the often overlooked middle child of the Hensley family, the dynasty behind Hensley Systems, one of the oldest software companies on the East Coast. When I drove up the long stone-paved driveway to our family's sprawling Connecticut estate that crisp November evening, I had no idea how much I would enjoy what was about to unfold. Dad stood by the window, pretending to check his phone, whispering excitedly to Mom with that same smug expression I'd grown up despising. What they didn't know was that beneath my calm smile and simple black cashmere dress beat the heart of someone who had waited 10 long years for this exact moment. The announcement Dad planned to make that Thanksgiving would indeed change the Hensley family forever, but not in the way he imagined. If you've ever been part of a family business that thrived on favoritism and betrayal, stay tuned. What I'm about to tell you is how I turned my father's arrogance into poetic justice, and how the family empire he built became mine in one unforgettable move. I grew up in Fairfield, one of Connecticut's wealthiest suburbs, a world of manicured lawns, silent electric dates, and families who cared more about their names in Forbes than their children's happiness. Our estate, Wexford Hall, was massive. 6 bedrooms, 2 home theaters, an indoor lap pool, and a garden that demanded 3 full-time landscapers to keep its perfection intact. On the outside, we looked like the poster family for American success. Old money meets new technology. The story of our fortune began with my grandfather, Arthur Hensley, a mechanical engineer who founded Hensley Systems in 1979 in his garage. His vision was simple: develop software that helped manufacturers manage inventory efficiently. His product took off, and within 2 decades, he turned a single codebase into a regional software empire. When he retired, my father, Richard Hensley, took over in 1998, expanding the company aggressively. Under his leadership, the business ballooned from a modest $15 million operation to a $60 million enterprise. For years, every family dinner, every vacation, every casual Sunday brunch somehow revolved around his brilliance as a businessman. Dad basked in his own legend. In the Connecticut business community, the Hensley name became synonymous with discipline, vision, and leadership. But what people didn't know was that behind those mahogany boardroom doors, there was a constant game of favoritism and dismissal, one where I was always the expendable piece. We were 3 children, Ethan, Clara, and Lila Hensley. Ethan, the eldest at 38, was the golden child, the heir apparent, the one Dad would have crowned even if he burned the company to the ground. Ethan never worked a real day in his life. He majored in business communications, partied through college, and yet walked straight into an executive position the week he graduated. He spent his time on yachts, golf courses, and luxury trips, flaunting his last name like it was a ticket to paradise. Somehow, Dad convinced himself that Ethan was the future of the company. Then there was me, Clara, the forgotten middle child. At 32, I was the one who actually cared about technology. I wrote my first program at 11, built a rudimentary logistics app at 15, and graduated from MIT with dual degrees in computer science and business strategy. I loved what my grandfather built, and I believed I could modernize it, make it cutting edge, efficient, and scalable for the new digital era. But no matter what I achieved, Dad looked at me as though I were a naive little girl playing pretend in a world of men. And then there was Lila, the youngest, 29, who somehow turned being a Hensley into a social media brand. She had millions of followers who admired her authentic glimpse into New England high society. Her life was a revolving carousel of fashion events, charity galas, and brunch photo shoots. Dad pretended to disapprove of her influencer nonsense, but deep down, he enjoyed the spotlight she brought to the family name. Mom, Evelyn Hensley, was the perfect hostess type. Elegant, polished, and perpetually tipsy by sunset. She believed that family issues could be solved with polite smiles and Chardonnay refills. Whenever I challenged Dad's arrogance, she'd sigh and whisper, "Clara, don't start a fight. You know how your father gets." In other words, keep quiet, stay invisible, and let the men talk. And that's what I did. for years. At family gatherings, Dad and Ethan would monopolize every conversation about business, while I sat quietly, half listening, half boiling inside. When I dared to offer an idea, Dad would chuckle condescendingly. "That's cute, Clara, but leave business decisions to the ones who live in the real world." The breaking point came when I was 22 years old. Fresh out of MIT, armed with an innovative prototype that could have redefined our company's entire product line, I walked into that boardroom believing I could finally prove myself. I had designed a cloud-based integration framework that could connect legacy manufacturing systems with modern online interfaces, something no one in our market had done yet. I'd spent months building the business model, projections, and technical documentation. Dad agreed to let me pitch it, as a formality. The day of the meeting, I walked into that walnut-paneled boardroom trembling with excitement. I connected my laptop, loaded the presentation, and began my pitch. The older board members, all friends of Dad's from the country club, watched with polite, empty smiles. 10 minutes in, Dad raised his hand, cutting me off mid-sentence. "That's enough," he said, glancing at his Rolex. "Sweetheart, this is imaginative, but this isn't how the real business world works. Our clients aren't looking for experimental ideas." I remember standing there frozen, humiliated, while he turned to the board with an apologetic grin. "My daughter just graduated college. She's full of these theoretical projects. Let's move on to real business, shall we?" They laughed. Every one of them. I packed up my materials, my throat tight, my hands shaking. That night, I made a silent promise. I would leave, build something on my own, and one day make him eat his words. A month later, I left Connecticut for San Francisco with only $6,000 in savings and a second-hand laptop. My parents assumed it was temporary. "She'll come back," I heard Dad tell Mom. "She's not built for the real world." He was wrong. The early years were brutal. I rented a studio apartment so small I could touch both walls at once. I lived on instant noodles and stale coffee, working 80 hours a week, first as a freelance coder, then as a startup consultant. Every spare dollar went into my own venture, Novalink Technologies, registered under a pseudonym, E.M. Steele. The initials stood for Evelyn Marie, my middle names. I didn't want anyone connecting me to the Hensleys. Not yet. But behind the scenes, I was already setting the next stage of my plan. For the next 2 years, I moved like a shadow in the corporate ecosystem surrounding my father's company. I studied every quarterly report, every partnership, every acquisition failure. Hensley Systems was no longer the titan it once was. While Dad clung to his outdated software like a relic, competitors were eating away at his market share. His empire was bleeding slowly, and he didn't even know the wound was self-inflicted. Through carefully constructed shell companies, I began quietly acquiring shares in the smaller firms that supplied Hensley Systems. Cloud providers, data security vendors, analytics partners. It was a chessboard, and every piece I moved brought me one step closer to checkmate. 6 months ago, Novalink's CFO, who had no idea I was the daughter of Richard Hensley, sent an anonymous acquisition offer to Hensley Systems through a third-party investment group. The offer was generous, a $50 million cash buyout with promises of retaining staff and legacy branding. Predictably, my father rejected it. "Some anonymous tech upstart doesn't get to buy my life's work," he told reporters in a local business interview. That interview was the moment I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. Now, 10 years after walking out of that boardroom humiliated, I was preparing to walk back into the family home, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the silent force that held their future in her hands. The week before Thanksgiving, I sat in my glass-walled corner office, overlooking the San Francisco Bay. The sunset painted the skyline in gold, reflecting off the ocean like a promise. My assistant, Naomi, entered with a folder in hand. "Your flight to Connecticut is confirmed for Tuesday at 11 a.m. Do you want to bring your executive team to Boston for the closing meeting?" I smiled faintly. "No, Naomi, this one's personal." After she left, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the folder containing the final acquisition paperwork. When my father signed it, he would unknowingly hand me control of everything he'd built. That night, I called Isabella, my best friend since those starving early days in San Francisco. We had lived in neighboring apartments with paper-thin walls. She'd heard every late-night coding breakdown and celebrated every small victory with me. "Tell me you're not actually flying home for Thanksgiving," she said as soon as she picked up. "Clara, after everything that family put you through?" I exhaled slowly. "I have to, Izzy. I need to see it happen with my own eyes. I need to see the moment he realizes who beat him." "Don't let it consume you," she warned softly. "You've already won. You don't need to twist the knife." But she didn't understand. This wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming the power he took from me when he laughed in my face and told me I didn't understand the real world. When I hung up, I started packing. I was deliberate about every detail: my wardrobe, my accessories, my presents. For years, I downplayed my success to my family, showing up in modest clothes and quiet tones. Not this time. This time, they would see who I'd become. I packed a tailored Armani suit, a Chanel dress for Thanksgiving dinner, Louboutin heels, and a Cartier watch. Pieces that spoke in the quiet language of real wealth. I didn't need to boast. People like my father noticed those details instinctively. On Tuesday morning, I boarded Novalink's private jet, something I rarely used despite my success. I preferred to travel unnoticed, but this trip warranted the symbolism. During the 5-hour flight, I reviewed the acquisition documents again and again. Every clause was ironclad, every signature line ready. When the jet landed at a private airfield outside Fairfield, a black Bentley waited for me on the tarmac. The driver opened the door with a polite nod, and I slipped inside, my heartbeat calm and measured. The drive through the old neighborhoods stirred a strange mix of nostalgia and defiance. The tall oak trees, the frozen ponds, the colonial houses trimmed in holiday lights. It all looked unchanged, like a photograph frozen in time. But I wasn't the same girl who'd left a decade ago. The Hensley estate stood just as I remembered. Pale stone walls, black shutters, the massive wrought iron gate bearing our family crest. The house glowed warmly in the cold evening air, every window lit as if to announce its pride to the world. I instructed the driver to wait at the bottom of the circular driveway and climbed the steps myself, suitcase in hand. Mom, Evelyn, answered the door before the housekeeper could. She still looked immaculate, her blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, her pearl necklace gleaming. "Clara, darling!" she exclaimed, hugging me tightly. I caught a faint whiff of her signature perfume and the sharper scent of white wine. "You look different. Is that a Cartier?" "Good eye," I said, smiling. "Oh, your father will be thrilled you made it home. He's been so busy with some big business deal. I can hardly get a word out of him." I followed her inside. The grand foyer hadn't changed. Marble floors, oil paintings of ancestors, the sweeping staircase. I placed my bag down beside the hall table where I'd once left my high school trophies, all gathering dust. "Where is Dad?" I asked. "In his study, as usual," Mom said with a little shrug. "He's practically married to that desk. I think he's finalizing something important for tomorrow." "Then I'll say hello," I replied, my voice smooth as silk. I knocked once on the heavy oak door before walking in without waiting for a response. The smell of cigars and leather filled the room. Dad looked up from his laptop, his glasses perched on his nose, surprise flickering across his face before settling into polite indifference. "Clara," he said, flatly, "you made it." "Of course," I replied, meeting his eyes evenly. He gestured vaguely towards the chair opposite his desk. "The flight from California was all right?" "Very smooth," I said. "Private flights tend to be." He frowned, confused. "Private? That must have cost a fortune." "Business has been good," I said casually. Before he could question further, his phone rang. "Excuse me, this is important," he muttered, turning away. As he spoke, I glanced at the papers spread across his desk and froze for a split second. There it was, the acquisition proposal from Novalink Technologies. My company's logo, my deal, my trap. My father had no idea that the faceless investor group he'd been negotiating with for weeks was me. He hung up moments later and smiled faintly. "Sorry about that. Just business. Nothing you'd understand." I matched his tone. "Of course, Dad. I'll let you get back to it." I left the study before he could see the smirk threatening to betray me. Upstairs, my old bedroom was exactly as I'd left it. Photos, trophies, the MIT pennant on the wall. It was like walking into a museum of someone I no longer was. The shelves of childhood books and computer science awards had become a shrine to the version of me he ignored. After freshening up, I went downstairs and found Ethan in the living room, lounging with a glass of scotch at 3 in the afternoon. His face was slightly bloated from years of excess, but he still carried that same effortless arrogance. "Well, look who decided to grace us with his presence," he drawled. "Still playing computer genius out west?" "Something like that," I replied evenly. He chuckled. "How's your little startup? Finally making any money?" "Enough," I said. Before he could push further, Leela appeared, phone in hand, camera already recording. "Clara's home!" she sang out. "Reunion time!" She wrapped an arm around me and whispered, "Wow, sis, you look expensive. Did you finally land yourself a billionaire boyfriend?" "No," I said smoothly. "Just working hard." From the corner of my eye, I caught Dad's voice echoing from the study again. "Yes, tomorrow after Thanksgiving, 50 million is the final offer. Novalink has been very insistent." I smiled to myself. Oh, he had no idea how insistent I could be. The day before Thanksgiving felt eerily calm, like the silent air before a storm. The house buzzed with quiet preparations, floral arrangements being delivered, the staff setting the long mahogany table, and the faint scent of roasted vegetables drifting from the kitchen. Everything appeared ordinary on the surface, yet beneath it all, the entire Hensley family stood on the edge of a reckoning they couldn't see coming. Mom floated from room to room, her silk robe flowing like smoke, barking gentle orders to the staff. "Leela, don't forget to capture some photos for your holiday campaign. And Ethan, darling, maybe hold off on the scotch until dinner this year." Ethan chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Relax, Mom, it's just one drink." Meanwhile, I stood in the corner of the grand living room, observing the scene. The walls, lined with portraits of stern ancestors, seemed to watch us silently, as though anticipating the downfall of their legacy. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Later that afternoon, I found Maria, the longtime housekeeper in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared stuffing. She smiled when she saw me. "Miss Clara, it's so good to see you again. You look happy." "I am, Maria," I said honestly, "more than I've been in years." She nodded knowingly, her eyes kind. "Your father's been restless all week. Keeps talking about some big announcement. I think he's proud of himself again." "Of course he is," I murmured. "He always is." Maria tilted her head. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad you came home. It feels important." I smiled faintly. "It will be." As night fell, the Hensleys gathered in the sitting room for pre-dinner drinks, a ritual as old as the company itself. The fire crackled, the chandeliers glowed, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Dad sat in his leather armchair, phone in hand, his brow furrowed in the familiar look of self-importance. Ethan bragged loudly about a new investment opportunity he barely understood. Leela live-streamed bits of the evening for her followers, holding her phone high as she narrated. Thanksgiving Eve at the Hensleys, tradition, elegance, and family love. Family love. The words almost made me laugh. Mom poured herself another glass of wine. Clara, dear, you've been so quiet. How's life in California? It's good, I said, simply, keeping my tone deliberately neutral. Busy, but rewarding. Dad glanced up for the first time. Still doing your tech thing? Yes, I replied. Still doing my tech thing. He grunted. Well, you should think about stability, you know? Real business, not these modern experiments. I smiled sweetly. Don't worry, Dad. My business is quite real. He didn't notice the edge beneath my words. As the night wore on, I excused myself to my old room. I stood before the mirror, brushing out my hair, my reflection illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. I could almost see the younger me, the hopeful girl who once believed that family meant support, not competition. But that girl was gone. What stood before the mirror now was someone forged by rejection and hunger, sharpened by years of silence and work. Tomorrow wasn't just Thanksgiving. It was the day the balance of power shifted forever. The next morning, sunlight poured through frosted windows, glinting off the silver tableware. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air. Lila floated around the dining room in a designer dress, recording everything for her holiday vlog. Ethan, predictably, was already on his second drink. Big day, huh, Dad? He said, smirking. Dad chuckled. You could say that. Is it about the company? Lila asked eagerly. Because if it's about the company, you should totally let me do the announcement on my channel. My audience loves that stuff. Dad laughed indulgently. No, sweetheart, this is business, not a photo shoot. I took my place quietly, watching him. He was positively glowing, his pride radiating through every smug grin. When dinner was finally served, the family gathered around the long table. The chandelier light bathed everything in gold. The silver candlesticks flickered. The table itself was a monument to wealth and history, a Hensley heirloom polished to a mirror sheen. As always, Dad sat at the head, Ethan at his right, Lila at his left. Mom sat at the far end, opposite him, trying to play the role of peacekeeper. And as usual, I was seated as far from him as possible, on the outer edge, next to an empty chair that might as well have been labeled invisible child. Dinner began with polite conversation. Vacuous, predictable, exhausting. Ethan talked about his new yacht, Lila about her brand partnerships. Dad nodded approvingly at both. When it was my turn to speak, I could feel all their eyes flicker toward me with detached curiosity, as if remembering I existed only because etiquette demanded it. I'm thankful for what I've learned this year, especially about patience, I said softly. Patience? Ethan mocked. Did your Wi-Fi go out again? They laughed. I smiled thinly. Mom clinked her glass. All right, everyone. Before dessert, your father has an announcement. Dad rose from his chair, his expression solemn but self-satisfied. I've been waiting to share this news until today, he began, his deep voice commanding attention. After months of negotiations, I'm finalizing the sale of Hensley Systems. It's the right move strategically and financially. This deal will ensure the company's future and secure our family legacy. Lila gasped dramatically. You're selling the company? To who? Dad smiled. To a major firm out of San Francisco called Novalink Technologies. For a split second, no one reacted. Then Ethan raised his bass. Congratulations, Dad. That's huge. Lila started filming again.
Oh my God, guys! The Hensley legacy lives on! I, meanwhile, kept my face perfectly still, though inside, I was savoring the slow, sweet burn of victory. Dad continued, oblivious. The contract will be finalized tomorrow. The CEO of Novalink, some woman named E.M. Steele, offered an incredible deal. Smart negotiator. I have to admit, I'm impressed. I tilted my head slightly. E.M. Steele, you said? He nodded. Yes. Apparently she's some kind of tech prodigy. Private, mysterious type. Never does interviews. I like that. Reminds me of myself. I felt laughter rising in my throat, but I swallowed it back. Interesting. You must be proud to be selling to such a visionary. Oh, I am. She's clearly got ambition. You could learn something from her, Clara. I met his eyes and smiled. Cold, sharp, knowing. The irony soared right over his head. Dinner arrived, a towering pumpkin pie topped with whipped cream. Mom clapped her hands, trying to lighten the air. To new beginnings, she toasted weakly. But the weight in the room had shifted. For the first time, Ethan looked uncertain. Wait, Dad, are you sure this is the right move? I mean, what about control? The board? What happens to us? Dad waved him off. Relax. The deal keeps the family shareholders in good standing. You'll still have positions, symbolic at least. The new owner wants to preserve the company's image. Lila frowned. So, we're like employees now? Dad chuckled. In a sense, but don't worry, the money will make up for it. I leaned back in my chair, swirling my wine. It's fascinating, I said casually, how sometimes the buyer ends up being the one person you least expect. He glanced at me, confused. What do you mean? Oh, nothing, I said with a small smile. He shrugged, dismissing me as usual. But this time, his dismissal didn't sting. It thrilled me. Because tomorrow morning, when he sat in his study and signed that contract, he'd realize too late that the woman behind Novalink wasn't a stranger from Silicon Valley. It was his daughter. The invisible one. The one he laughed at. The one who learned the business world better than he ever did. Thanksgiving night ended with laughter and wine and fake smiles, but beneath that polished veneer, something dark and electric hummed in the air. The house slowly grew quiet after midnight. The snow had begun to fall, layering the estate in a soft white blanket. I sat awake in my old room, staring out at the frosted window, unable to sleep. Tomorrow, everything would shift. Tomorrow, Richard Hensley would wake up believing he was in control, and by sundown, he'd realize that control had already slipped through his fingers long ago. I spent hours replaying every step in my mind, every document I signed, every alias I used, every strategic acquisition that had brought Hensley Systems under Novalink's shadow. The company he was selling didn't just own his business. It owned his vendors, his data centers, and his patents. By the time the ink dried, every thread of his empire would be tied to me. Morning came crisp and cold. The snow glittered on the lawns, the trees bending slightly under its weight. I dressed deliberately. A fitted charcoal suit, sleek heels, and a platinum watch that caught the light with every movement. Power, subtle and precise. Downstairs, the family gathered for breakfast. Dad was already in high spirits, reading through what he believed were the final sale documents. Ethan and Lila chatted half-heartedly, still groggy from the previous night's excesses. Mom was quiet, her usual morning calm masking the faint tension in her eyes. Well, Dad announced, tapping his papers with satisfaction, today is the day. Once I sign this deal, the future of Hensley Systems is secured. Novalink will take the reins, and I'll finally have time to enjoy retirement. Retirement? Ethan asked sharply, lowering his coffee mug. You're stepping down? Dad nodded. Of course. It's time for the next generation to lead, under Novalink's guidance, of course. Ethan's jaw tightened. And where does that leave me? Dad chuckled, as if humoring a child. Still in the picture, son. They've agreed to retain a few executive positions. Don't worry, you'll get your title. Optics matter. Ethan said nothing. He simply stared down at his plate, his knuckles whitening. Congratulations, Richard, Mom said softly, forcing a smile. You've earned this. He smiled proudly, oblivious to the uncomfort creeping around the table. This is what your father always dreamed of, a family legacy that lasts. I sipped my coffee and met his eyes over the rim of the cup. Legacies are funny things. They don't always end the way people expect. He frowned at me for a beat, then waved off the comment. You've always been the philosophical one, Clara. After breakfast, he disappeared into his study, calling for the notary who was scheduled to witness the signing. I followed a few minutes later, pausing by the doorway. Dad, I said, knocking gently.
He looked up, smiling distractedly. Clara, I'm in the middle of something important. I know, I said, stepping inside. I just wanted to see it. The big moment. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Ah, finally showing interest in the family business, huh? Something like that, I said, glancing at the folder on his desk. The Novalink logo gleamed in silver ink. I traced it with my gaze, feeling the thrill pulse through me. He flipped to the signature page. Once I sign this, Novalink officially owns Hensley Systems. It's strange, you know, letting go after all these years, but it's time. Is it? I asked softly. He frowned slightly. Of course, change is inevitable, Clara. That's how business works. I smiled faintly. You've never believed in change, Dad. That's why this is poetic. He blinked. What's poetic? Before I could answer, the notary arrived, a young man in a dark suit, briefcase in hand. Mr. Hensley, I'm here to finalize the contract. Dad nodded briskly, motioning him to sit. Yes, let's get started. I stood silently as they reviewed the final details. Dad skimmed through the legal jargon impatiently, eager to sign. When the pen finally touched paper, I felt the entire world shift. There, he said, proudly, placing the pen down. Done. Official. Novalink now owns Hensley Systems. Not quite, I said, my voice calm but cutting. He looked up sharply. What? The documents still require the countersignature of Novalink's majority shareholder. You've only signed your portion. He frowned. Yes, of course. Their representative will handle that later. E.M. Steele, right? I was told she's sending someone to finalize it. I stepped closer, sliding the final page toward him. My signature was already there. Elegant, deliberate, undeniable. E.M. Steele. His eyes froze on the name. Confusion flickered across his face, then disbelief, then the slow dawning of realization. No, he whispered. That's impossible. Oh, it's very possible, I said softly. In fact, it's already done. You just sold Hensley Systems to me. He stared at me, his face paling, the color draining from his cheeks. You? I nodded, the satisfaction in my voice smooth and unhurried. E.M. Steele, Evelyn Marie Steele. My middle names. You never cared enough to ask what I was doing in California. You just assumed I'd failed. But I didn't fail. I built something bigger, stronger, and smarter than your entire empire, and now I own it. He slammed his fist on the desk. You tricked me. I met his fury with calm precision. No, I offered you salvation. Hensley Systems was dying. Your outdated infrastructure, your blind loyalty to the past, it was killing everything Grandpa built. I just saved the company.
You should be thanking me." He rose from his chair, shaking with rage. "You had no right." "I had every right," I interrupted, my voice like steel. "You told me once that I didn't understand the real world. Well, I learned, and I played it better than you ever could." He glared at me, chest heaving, but his power had already evaporated. The notary looked between us, unsure whether to leave or stay. "You can go," I told him. The young man nodded quickly, gathering his papers and slipping out. When the door shut, silence filled the room. "You humiliated me," I said quietly. "In front of your board, your friends, your entire company. You laughed at my ideas. You called them unrealistic. You said I wasn't built for business. And yet, here we are." He sank back into his chair, defeated, his voice hoarse. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, walking toward the window, "I take over. I'm rebranding, restructuring, and modernizing everything you let rot. The employees will keep their jobs. You'll retire comfortably, but make no mistake, the Hensley name is no longer yours to protect. It's mine to redefine." He didn't speak. His shoulders slumped, his reflection hollow in the glass. I turned to him one last time. "You always said business was about power, Dad, but you forgot the one rule of power. It changes hands." And with that, I left his study. The rest of the house seemed frozen when I stepped into the hall. My mother appeared at the top of the staircase, her expression confused. "Clara, what happened?" I met her gaze and smiled faintly. "Dad just made me the head of the family business." Downstairs, Ethan's voice rose from the living room. "What's going on?" But I didn't answer. I just walked past them all, calm, poised, and unstoppable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was the legacy, and it was finally mine. The house was silent when I stepped outside. The air was sharp for winter, the snow falling in lazy spirals under the gray sky. The same front door I'd once stormed out of as a humiliated 22-year-old now opened for me like a coronation gate. The past had finally come full circle. Inside, though, chaos erupted. Voices overlapped in the hallway behind me. Ethan stormed out of Dad's study, face red with anger. "What the hell did you do, Clara? Dad looks like he's seen a ghost." I turned slowly, my heels clicking against the marble floor. He just realized ghosts don't stay buried forever. "Enough riddles," he snapped. "You're telling me you're the one who bought the company? That's impossible." "Impossible," I said softly, tilting my head. That word has never stopped me.
The signature pages gleamed in the morning light. His signature, my signature, two worlds colliding on a single sheet of paper. And suddenly, the rush of victory doled. I'd waited years for this moment, for the satisfaction of watching my father's pride crumble. But as I stood there, surrounded by stunned faces, the triumph didn't feel as sharp as I'd imagined. It was softer, quieter, almost mournful. Revenge wasn't fire.
It was frost. Slow, numbing, irreversible. I excused myself, stepping outside again into the snow. The air bit at my cheeks, grounding me. A few minutes later, the door creaked open behind me. It was Dad. He joined me on the porch, his coat draped over his shoulders, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold. "You planned this for a long time," he said finally. 10 years, I replied without hesitation. He nodded slowly. "You're your grandfather's granddaughter. Arthur would have admired that." The unexpected admission caught me off guard. I turned to look at him, searching for sarcasm, but there was none. His eyes, tired, regretful, met mine with something dangerously close to respect. "You did what I couldn't," he said quietly. "You saw the future coming and built it yourself. I should have seen it in you, I just couldn't." I felt a strange tightness in my chest, something between anger and grief. "You didn't want to. That's different," I said. He sighed, looking out over the snow. "Maybe, but for what it's worth, you were right. You always were." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the wind whispering through the frozen trees. Then he said, almost to himself, "You know, when your mother told me you were flying in, I thought this would be another tense holiday. I had no idea it would be the end of an era." "It's not the end," I said softly. "It's just not your story anymore." He looked at me for a long time, then gave a small, sad smile. "Then make it a better one." And with that, he turned and went back inside, leaving me alone with the snow and the silence. Two months later, Hensley Systems officially became Nova Hensley Technologies, a merger in name only since I now controlled everything. The rebranding went global overnight. Articles filled business pages with headlines like, "Mysterious CEO E.M. Steele revealed as heiress Clara Hensley." Ethan resigned within weeks, too proud to work under me. Leela pivoted her influencer career to female empowerment, posting photos captioned, "Proud of my sister's success." Mom adapted as she always did, hosting quiet luncheons for her friends, pretending this had all been part of some long-term family plan. And Dad? He kept to himself. We spoke occasionally, polite, cautious exchanges about company transitions. There was no warmth, but there was respect. In its strange way, that was enough. One evening, as I stood in my San Francisco office overlooking the glowing skyline, Naomi entered with a smile. "The new quarterly numbers are in. We've surpassed projections again." I smiled faintly. "Good. Keep pushing the integrations. We're just getting started." When she left, I turned toward the window. My reflections stared back. A woman forged by betrayal, sharpened by ambition, and tempered by time. 10 years ago, I'd left my father's house humiliated. Now I stood at the top of the very world he said I wasn't ready for. Was it revenge? Yes. But it was also evolution. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't destroying what hurt you, it's becoming everything it said you couldn't be. And as the city lights shimmered below, I whispered to the ghost of that 22-year-old girl I used to be. "You were always enough."